Hi, welcome to another episode of Rants from My Kitchen. And I want to address an amicus brief that was filed on behalf of the Mississippi gestational age abortion bill. Um, and this bill was passed in 2018 and, of course, immediately challenged, immediately blocked by the courts. Um, and basically, it says no abortions past 15 weeks. And that's actually a little bit vague because does that mean um, 15 weeks it's okay, 15 weeks in one day it's not? Like in Pennsylvania, 24 weeks is okay, 24 and a half weeks is not. Even 24 weeks in one day is not legal. Um, so, at any rate, in the legislative findings and purpose, they go through a lot of stuff like the U.S. is only one of only 7 nations that permits elective abortions after 20 weeks of gestation. 75% of all nations don't allow it after 12 weeks, and then goes through a bunch of prenatal milestones and talks about how the abortions are performed, which is the majority after 15 weeks, or the D&E, which are really, really nasty. Um, Basically, it's taking forceps, just reaching in and pulling parts off. Um, Leroy Carhart was testifying in Carhart versus Gonzalez, and he talked about how um, even after he's pulled a couple of limbs off, he can look on ultrasound and still see the heart beating. So, the cause of death being dismemberment. Um, and Warren Hearn, who even he's got no gestational limit on abortions. It's kind of whether or not he sympathizes with the woman's justification for the abortion, and I can't imagine him ever saying no. Um, he said the sensations of dismemberment flow through the forceps like an electric current. So they're arguing that the baby is past these developmental milestones before it hits 15 weeks. They're not saying what specifically happens at 15 weeks. Um, they're saying that after 15 weeks, it uses this really nasty, barbaric practice, which it is, extremely nasty. And then it talks a bit about risks. Um, Noting that the risks are significantly greater after 8 weeks gestation, which is 6 weeks past the conception. So, I mean, it's not really clear anywhere why they chose 15 weeks. I can't find it. But at any rate, yesterday, um, Robin Pierucci, MD, I'm not sure I can pronounce her name, um, and the Life Legal Defense Foundation filed an amicus brief in support of the law, and I marked some interesting um, elements here. First of all, we've got her qualifications. She's been a practicing neonatologist for over 20 years, which is dealing specifically with newborns. Um, she's active in perinatal palliative care. And what that is, say there's a diagnosis that the baby has a health problem, then what she works on, if it's something that is fatal to the baby, then making sure that comfort care is ready when the baby's born. So um, she's highly qualified. Um, and one of the things she finds fault with is that there are 2 standards of care um, for the same human. You've got this human, and this human is in the womb. Say we've got one in that's being carried by Susan, and one that's being carried by Betty. And Susan is planning to have her baby, and the doctor who is taking care of Susan has these responsibilities toward that baby, but if the other woman decides she wants an abortion, you can just kill that baby. So there's two different standards of care for humans of the same age. So one of the things that the bill is challenging is the idea that the cutoff for abortion should be viability. And she spends a lot of time pointing out that that's sort of a nonsensical concept. You can't pin viability down. There's factors including the physician's competence, their education in neonatal medicine, and even personal and institutional philosophies, and physician attitudes towards disabilities and societal challenges. A lot of doctors, at the first sign of trouble, they'll push for an abortion because they feel that life with a disability isn't worth living. So one of the things that they're looking to do is to revisit the idea that viability should be the deciding factor of when you start protecting the unborn human, and that the interest in preserving the life of that human being should not be contingent on the entirely unrelated question of the possible medical outcomes if the mother went into labor and delivered the baby prematurely. And notes that in Cruzan versus the Missouri Department of Health, the Supreme Court found that the state does have an interest in life itself that doesn't have to have a certain quality before it's worth protecting. And cites Brittle v. United States in 2004 that found it is not the role of the courts to draw lines as to which fetal abnormalities or birth defects are so severe as to negate the state's otherwise legitimate interest in the fetus's potential life. So I think that's addressing the fact that there'll be an abortion ban up until certain age, unless the baby has a disability, and then that baby's no longer protected. So one of the things that the law is asking is to just sever that idea that viability is the relevant point. This is just more elaboration on that. The one court case they refer to assigned the role of assessing the viability of fetuses to the responsible attending physician. In other words, whoever is about to perform the abortion. And first of all, as they point out, this is not somebody with training in neonatology. Is likely an OBGYN, but not necessarily an OBGYN. A lot of abortion doctors are not OBGYNs. But there's also a conflict of interest that I want to point out, which is that this doctor has been paid to ensure that you do not get a live baby. And you cannot just make this sudden change. Oops, it's out, it's breathing, it's crying. I have to whisk it to the NICU. You can't be intending to kill somebody and then all of a sudden completely change your mind. Kind of the parallel would be Guido the hitman is supposed to kill Mr. Spinalzo. And let's say Guido shoots Mr. Spinalzo, and Mr. Spinalzo falls down and he's gasping and he's crying for his mother. Mr. Spinalzo isn't going to call 911. He's going to Guido the hitman is going to do one of two things. He is either going to just leave Mr. Spinalzo there to bleed out, or if he thinks somebody might show up and rescue Mr. Spinalzo before he dies, he might pop in one more time to finish him off. But Guido the hitman, who has been hired to kill Mr. Spinalzo, is not going to suddenly change his mind about killing Mr. Spinalzo just because he survived the first attempt to kill him. And it's the same thing with these babies. I mean, it makes no sense that if the baby survives your attempt to kill it, that all of a sudden you're going to be vested in making sure that this baby gets medical care. And she points out neonatologists, not obstetricians, are the experts in viability. In fact, she notes among abortion providers, infant survival is a complication to be avoided. And again, just talks about how viability varies based on the skill of the clinician, how interested they are in saving the baby, what they think of disabilities, because a lot of doctors, oh, this baby's only 24 weeks. If we save it, it might have a disability and that's just not worth it, blah, 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 blah. So, and I made some notes about that. And, you know, how if you don't treat them, they die. Yeah, so it's like various studies have shown that when adjusted for future life expectancy, costs for NICU, that's neonatal intensive care units, costs for NICU treatments are 1/20th to 1/10 the cost of treatments for adult ICU patients. But some researchers and doctors are reluctant to allow that the quality of life obtained is worth the treatment cost. So you wind up with, as she points out, this circular dynamic where you figure this baby's not worth saving, so you just kind of put it on some oxygen and leave it there. You aren't really giving that baby the support that would allow him or her to thrive, which leads to poor outcomes, which reinforces the idea that it's not worth bothering to save them because they're just going to have disabilities. And then also noticing that there's different rates of survival based on race and zip code. So viability is a prediction, not a point. And even if there were such a point, it would be impossible for most doctors, especially abortion doctors, who rarely provide care even for uncomplicated pregnancies, to determine where it is. So what they're doing is drawing the line at 15 weeks. And they're noting that they never suggested that after 15 weeks it can survive. Basically, it's challenging the idea that it's viability. And again, noticing that the determination of viability is being left to the decision of the abortion doctor who, you know, he's being paid to get rid of it. So they're noting the state's interest in the fetus as an entity in itself, and the character of this entity does not change at the point of viability under conventional medical wisdom. So let me see if there's any other points I wanted to raise here. Yeah, the viability argument, there's an analogy that they draw. It's the concept of being pool safe. Figure that that's the stage of development in which a child has a reasonable chance of surviving if he or she falls into a swimming pool. And if you want to compare that to viability, then you could say that the state cannot act to protect a child who is not pool safe from being held face down in a bucket of water to drown. You know, just because it could not survive if it accidentally fell in the pool doesn't justify drowning it. So again, viability is determined by the abortion provider as workable only in the sense that it is unenforceable and thus does not get rise to difficult cases. It works for the abortion industry, but not for the baby. So that's that. Now we come here. Again, I'm trying to figure out why 15 weeks. Now, you look, the only abortion clinic in the state does abortions up to 16 weeks. And they start doing those D&E dismemberments at 12 weeks. So if the idea is to prevent them from reaching in with forceps and ripping limbs off, then your cutoff point should be 12 weeks, not 15. It's almost like they chose 15 so that it's taking away 1 week of potential sales. I came here to Endowment for Human Development, just looking at some of the developmental milestones. And this is really a fun page to go through. It's got some 4D ultrasounds. It's got where they use one of those cameras, those fiber optic cameras, into the womb to observe the baby. And so like 8 weeks makes sense. 8 weeks following conception, which is 10 weeks into the pregnancy. And at that, it's considered the end of the embryonic period and the start of the fetal period.
During the first 8 weeks following fertilization, the developing human is called an embryo, which means growing within. This time, called the embryonic period, is characterized by the formation of most major body systems.
Okay, so all the body systems are in place. The digestive system, the respiratory system, the circulatory system are all there. And this is a little more about the end of the embryonic period.
8 weeks marks the end of the embryonic period. During this time, the human embryo has grown from a single cell into the nearly 1 billion cells which form over 4,000 distinct anatomic structures. The embryo now possesses more than 90% of the structures found in adults.
So that point makes sense. Now, if we look at 3 months, which is 12 weeks, which would be 14 weeks gestation, not 15, that's when, except for a small part on the back and top of the head, the entire body is now responsive to touch.
With the exception of the back and the top of the head, the body of the entire fetus now responds to light touch.
So you could argue at this point that it might be extremely painful to be pulled apart with forceps. So I could see that as being where they decide to cut it off. And then here at 4 months, 1 week, which is 17 weeks or 19 weeks gestation, they can measure the hormonal stress response.
By 16 weeks, procedures involving the insertion of a needle into the abdomen of the fetus trigger a hormonal stress response, releasing noradrenaline or norepinephrine into the bloodstream.
Okay. So, and remember at this point, they're still reaching in with forceps and just pulling off arms and legs. Later, like this is 16 weeks. When you start to get to 20 weeks, they'll jab a needle straight into the heart for a lethal injection. So there's all these different points where it makes some kind of sense to draw the line there. But 15 weeks is just kind of a mystery point to me. I'll let you know if I ever find out. But I think that if nothing else, for that vagueness, do they mean it's no longer legal at 15 weeks 1 day, or it's legal for the entire 15 week, and when you hit 16 weeks, which is 14 weeks from conception, that it's illegal? So mystery to me. We shall see.